Have you ever been called cold? Not in anger, not with shouting, but in those subtle moments, the quiet glances, the offhand comments, the way someone pulls back from you and says, "You just don't feel things the way other people do." You know that moment. It lingers. It lands differently. Because the truth is, you do feel. You feel everything, but in a way that doesn't ask for attention, in a way that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Still, you start to question yourself. Am I emotionally distant? Do I lack empathy? Is something wrong with me? And yet, inside there's this complexity, this sensitivity, this constant monitoring of everyone's emotional state, except your own. Here's what no one tells you. Neuroscience shows us that some people are wired for internal processing. They don't react impulsively because their nervous system filters emotion before expression. That's not emotional coldness. That's a sign of regulation, awareness, control. But most of the world doesn't recognize that. They've been trained to equate feeling with reaction. And silence makes them uncomfortable, so they project. They label your calm as cold, your stillness as indifference, your emotional clarity as distance. And little by little you start to shrink, not because you believe them entirely, but because no one ever gave you a language to protect your truth. Until now. Because in this video, I'm going to show you why being misread doesn't mean being broken, the psychology behind low-reactive emotional styles, how to stop explaining yourself and start standing in your clarity, and what to say the next time someone calls you cold without betraying who you are. So stay with me. Because if you've ever felt invisible, misunderstood, or judged for being calm under pressure, what you're about to hear will do more than validate you. It will reintroduce you to yourself. Let's start with something most people never question. What if your emotional coldness isn't who you are, but who you were trained to be? You weren't born distant. You weren't born detached. You were conditioned, shaped over time, moment by moment, to be emotionally controlled, quiet, non-reactive. Not because it felt natural, but because it felt safer. Maybe you grew up in a home where expressing emotion led to punishment, or where your role was to keep the peace, to stay calm while others exploded. Or maybe it wasn't dramatic at all. Maybe your emotions were just unseen. No one asked how you felt. No one mirrored your interior life. So you adapted. You learned that showing too much made people uncomfortable. You learned to stay ahead of chaos by staying invisible. And slowly, your nervous system internalized a truth that no one said out loud. It's better if I don't react. That's not coldness, that's intelligence. Neuroadaptive behavior. Your brain learning to minimize external expression as a strategy for survival. In psychology, we call this low-reactive emotional conditioning. It's common in children raised in emotionally unpredictable environments. The nervous system becomes trained to anticipate stress and neutralize it before it shows on the surface. This doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you feel first, process internally, and respond only when it's safe. But the world misreads that, because it's trained to respond to volume, not vibration. Let's make it real. You're in a meeting at work. Tensions are high. Someone raises their voice, another person cuts in. You stay calm, you stay focused. After the meeting, someone pulls you aside. You didn't seem affected. Do you even care? And there it is. That split between how you experience emotion and how others expect you to express it. But here's the truth. You weren't made wrong. You were made resilient. And the same nervous system that helped you survive emotionally complex spaces is now being mistaken for emotional indifference. That misunderstanding is what this whole video is here to undo. Because once you stop believing that emotional expression is the only proof of emotional truth, you free yourself from decades of false guilt. And you begin the real work. Not becoming more expressive, but becoming more aligned with the way you actually process the world. This isn't about learning to feel. It's about unlearning the belief that you have to prove it. Let's get something clear. Most people aren't actually reading you, they're reading themselves, reflected on you. It's a psychological reflex called emotional projection. When someone expects you to feel the way they do and you don't, they assume something is wrong with you. Not because it's true, but because it disrupts their emotional map. We all have an internal emotional mirror. When people react in a way we recognize, it feels safe, predictable. But when someone like you shows emotional stillness, especially during conflict, stress, or intimacy, that mirror cracks. They don't know what to do with your calm. So instead of asking, "How do you feel?" they ask, "Why aren't you reacting?" And that question isn't curiosity, it's discomfort. Here's what's really happening. Your emotional style isn't invalid. It's just illegible to people who've never learned to read internal processors. Neuroscience confirms this. Dr. Andrew Huberman, a leading Stanford neuroscientist, explains that some individuals exhibit a high degree of top-down emotional regulation, where the prefrontal cortex actively modulates emotional expression from the limbic system. These people feel deeply, but they don't display it in ways others expect. Their emotional signals are quieter, more controlled, and often invisible to the untrained eye. But here's the twist. The average person expects emotions to be shown, not held. So when you manage your responses, they interpret it as lack of feeling, not mastery of self. Let's make it real. You're in a relationship. Your partner gets overwhelmed, speaks emotionally. You pause, you process, you offer a calm reply. They get frustrated. You're so robotic. Do you even feel anything? They're not reading you, they're reacting to the absence of drama. And in doing so, they expose their dependency on mirrored emotion, rather than attuned understanding. But your stillness isn't absence. It's delay, a boundary, a pause, a deeper form of presence. So no, they don't misread you because you're unclear. They misread you because they've never learned to recognize regulated emotional intelligence. And when you start to believe they're misunderstanding, you shrink. You soften your clarity to make them comfortable. But clarity isn't a threat, it's a gift. So next time they say you don't feel, remember, it's not that you feel less. You just don't leak. And that kind of regulation, it's not coldness. It's emotional mastery, backed by neuroscience. Let's dismantle a dangerous myth. That stillness means you don't care. Because in truth, stillness when chosen is a mark of emotional mastery, not detachment. We live in a culture obsessed with reaction, where the louder the emotion, the more real it's considered, where crying, yelling, venting are treated as proof of passion and love. So when you stay calm, in the heat of conflict, in moments of stress and conversations that trigger others, you're not seen as strong. You're seen as cold, but they're wrong. Stillness is what happens when the nervous system is trained to regulate instead of react. It's what occurs when the prefrontal cortex overrides impulse from the amygdala. It's not absence, it's choice. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, one of the most cited neuroscientists on emotion, explains that emotional expressions are not direct reflections of feelings, but predictions shaped by past experience, context, and regulation capacity. Meaning, staying composed doesn't mean you're disconnected. It means your brain and body are processing more consciously than most. Now think about this. You're at a family gathering. Tension rises over something trivial. Someone throws a passive-aggressive comment. Everyone's watching. You breathe. You don't respond. You shift the energy without escalating it. Later someone says, "You didn't defend yourself. Why don't you ever stand up?" But what they don't see is that you did, in your own way, through presence, through regulation, through refusal to give your energy to chaos. Because here's the truth. Emotionally reactive people often feel empowered by externalizing, but they exhaust themselves and others in the process. You conserve, you hold, you move slower because your feelings mean something and you don't toss them around for show. That's not emotional laziness, that's discipline. And yet, discipline is rarely celebrated in emotional spaces, which is why you're constantly misunderstood. But now you don't need them to get it. You need you to stop questioning it. Your stillness is not an emotional void. It's a container, a filter, a choice to respond from alignment instead of reaction. And while others may lose themselves in the noise, you anchor yourself in clarity. It's not that you don't feel. It's that you've spent a lifetime learning how not to leak. So next time someone confuses your composure for indifference, you don't need to defend it. Just remember, the most dangerous storms are silent before they hit, and the strongest people don't announce their power. They carry it. Let's talk about something you've probably done more times than you can count: explaining yourself, clarifying your intentions, translating your calm, justifying your silence, not because you were wrong, but because someone didn't feel satisfied with your lack of reaction. You felt that invisible pressure to soften your tone so it doesn't sound cold, to add a smile at the end of your sentence so it doesn't feel sharp, to offer extra context, emotional footnotes and disclaimers, not because you were unclear, but because they couldn't handle how clear you actually were. That's not communication, that's emotional self-censorship. Here's what's likely happening underneath. You're carrying a learned survival pattern, one that developed in early relationships where being misunderstood wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. In trauma theory, this is often called the fawn response, when in the face of discomfort or conflict, You try to appease, over-accommodate, or over-explain to avoid disconnection. You learned that clarity could trigger rejection, so instead of being honest in your stillness, you wrapped it in sugar to keep people close. Picture this. You're in a conversation with someone close. You say something clear but neutral, like, "I'm not ready to talk about this right now." You mean it calmly. You're grounded, but they freeze, their face shifts. Suddenly you feel the tension, so you rush in. "I didn't mean that in a harsh way, I'm just tired. It's not about you. I just want to make sure you're okay too." You keep explaining layer after layer, not because you weren't clear, but because they weren't emotionally prepared for clarity without apology. And in that moment, you trade truth for safety, presence for peacekeeping. It shows up like this. You send a simple message. They don't respond. You spiral, you double text, add context, explain what you meant. Because some part of you is convinced, if they misunderstood me, they'll pull away. So I better fix it, quickly. That's not emotional immaturity, it's emotional hypervigilance. Your nervous system is scanning for misattunement. And every time someone calls you cold or hard to read, you feel a pressure to decode yourself, as if your truth has to be translated to be valid. But here's the thing. The need to be constantly understood is often a trauma echo, not a communication goal. When you explain yourself too much, you send a message to your own body that your natural way of being isn't safe. And that becomes exhausting. We call it clarity fatigue. You start to resent how much work it takes just to feel seen. Not because you're unclear, but because you're surrounded by people who only recognize one emotional language, their own. The solution isn't to shut down. It's to stop shrinking into readability. You are not a caption for someone else's emotional comfort. You are not a translation device for someone else's triggers. You are a full emotional system, complete, clean, and real. And if that's too quiet for them, that says everything about their emotional literacy and nothing about your emotional depth. Let's get this straight. You're not emotionally distant. You're emotionally self-regulating. And that's not a flaw. It's a form of intelligence. But here's the problem. In a world trained to trust noise over nuance, your silence gets misread. Your self-control gets labeled as avoidance. Your emotional steadiness? They call it detachment. But you know the truth. You're feeling everything. You're just not broadcasting it. That's emotional bandwidth, not emotional disconnection. Here's the science behind it. Your nervous system operates on a spectrum. People with high reactivity tend to feel emotions like a wave crashing over them. Immediate, intense, visible. But people like you, those with strong parasympathetic regulation, feel internally first. You process before reacting. You stabilize before responding. You regulate. This is especially true if your ventral vagal system, the part of your nervous system responsible for calm, connection, and presence, is well developed. It means you're wired to stay centered when others spiral. But most people don't see that as strength. Because most people were never taught the value of internal regulation. Let's put this in a scene. You're in a relationship. Your partner is venting. They're overwhelmed. You stay grounded, you listen, you breathe. You don't interrupt, you don't escalate, you don't collapse. When they finish, you respond with clarity. "I hear you, and I'm here. Let's figure this out." But instead of appreciation, you get, "You don't seem to care. You're too calm." It hits like a punch. Because you were present, you were tuned in. You just didn't perform it the way they expected. This is where the misunderstanding lives. They expect co-regulation through mirrored reactivity. You offer co-regulation through internal stability. You're not trying to suppress, you're trying to protect. Your own system, their emotions, the space between. And that makes you seem distant in a world addicted to visible emotion. But make no mistake, you're not withholding, you're managing. You've trained your nervous system not to offload onto others. You've built an internal buffer between stimulus and reaction. And that's not emotional detachment. That's emotional fluency. So the next time they say, "You're so distant," reframe it for yourself. "I'm not distant. I'm just no longer broadcasting my emotions to people who only understand volume." Because being emotionally self-regulating isn't cold, it's conscious, and it's rare. And the ones who can feel your energy, even in your quiet, those are the people worth keeping. Here's a truth that most people can't articulate, but they feel it when you walk into the room. Your emotional control makes people nervous. Not because you're aggressive, not because you're cold, but because they can't locate your vulnerability. And in a world that confuses chaos with authenticity, self-mastery looks like a threat. Let's break this down. Emotional control isn't about suppressing your truth. It's about knowing when, where, and how to express it with intention. That's executive function. That's emotional leadership. Neuroscience shows us that emotional regulation activates the prefrontal cortex, the brain's command center for long-term thinking, boundary making, and conscious response. You're not numbing out. You're choosing presence over impulse. That's not absence. That's alignment. But here's the paradox. The more calm you are, the more in control you appear, the more unreadable you become to people who rely on emotional performance to decode trust. And unreadable equals, I can't predict you, and if I can't predict you, I can't control the space. Now you become the variable, the one they can't influence. And that feels like power, even if you never asked for it. Let's bring this to life. You're in a team meeting. Everyone's pushing opinions. Voices rise, you stay quiet, you assess. You speak once, calmly, clearly, decisively. The room shifts, not because you dominated, but because your composure exposed the chaos. And some people admire that, but others, they feel threatened. Not by what you said, but by how little you needed to say it. This is what they don't realize. People who control their emotions aren't trying to overpower the room. They're protecting the room from their own unfiltered intensity. You're not cold, you're careful, because you know what your full emotional force could do, and you choose to wield it with precision. But when people aren't used to emotional intelligence expressed through silence, presence, or minimalism, they misinterpret it as superiority. They'll say, "You think you're better than everyone? You act like nothing affects you." No, you've just trained yourself to feel without leaking, and that's a kind of power that doesn't perform. So here's the truth. Your control isn't rejection, it's restraint. Your regulation isn't a mask, it's maturity. And if that unnerves them, maybe it's not because you lack emotion. Maybe it's because you embody the one thing they never learned how to hold: emotional power without emotional performance. It keeps happening. You attract people who are intense, emotionally chaotic, unpredictable. At first they seem energized, passionate, deeply connected, but later, they become draining, volatile, and reactive. And if you're not careful, you start asking, why do I keep ending up with people like this? Here's the answer. It's not because you're broken. It's because you're stable. Emotionally dysregulated people are drawn to emotionally regulated people, not consciously, but neurologically. Your nervous system carries a rhythm they can't create on their own. So they seek yours, often without realizing it. Bruce Perry, renowned trauma expert and co-author of What Happened to You, explains it like this. When people grow up without consistent emotional safety, their nervous systems seek it out later, not through logic, but through attraction to stability, even if they can't tolerate it long term. That's you. You're the stability they crave and then later reject. Let's paint the picture. You meet someone new. They say, you feel so calm, so easy to be around. They admire your grounding presence. You listen, you don't overreact, you create space. But weeks or months in, it flips. Now your calm is cold. Your pauses are distance. Your consistency is lack of passion. What changed? Your energy hasn't shifted, but their nervous system, so used to chaos, starts to feel agitated in the presence of calm. Because calm requires them to feel what they've been avoiding. That's when they start pulling, testing, escalating. And you hold, you regulate. You think, if I just stay clear, they'll come back to center. But they don't, because clarity isn't what they're looking for, and it's what they're afraid of. This is how emotional polarity works. You become their emotional anchor. They become your emotional weight. And instead of meeting in the middle, you start overcompensating. You explain more. You validate more. You drain yourself trying to keep their storm from sinking your ship. But here's the thing. You are not a nervous system for rent. You're not here to carry someone else's emotional instability just because your steadiness makes them feel safe. If they confuse your regulation for rejection, that's their healing to do, not yours to manage. So the next time you find yourself pulled into someone's emotional chaos, stop asking, what's wrong with me? Ask instead, is their intensity soothing my system, or am I letting their storm hijack my peace? Because your calm isn't the problem. It's the proof that you've done the work, and you don't owe that to anyone who hasn't. Here's what no one told you. The way you process emotions isn't a flaw to fix. It's a compass, pointing toward your clarity, your values, your truth. You've spent years, maybe decades, adjusting your tone, softening your language, questioning your reactions. You've tried to be more expressive, more emotional, more like everyone else. But all that effort wasn't for self-growth. It was for survival. It was you trying to be understood in a world that only recognizes volume, not depth. But the truth is, you don't need to change your emotional style. You need to trust it. Emotional intelligence isn't about how well you emote. It's about how well you navigate. And you've been navigating complexity in silence longer than anyone knows. The world may never clap for your restraint. It may never validate your ability to remain composed under pressure. But that doesn't make it less valuable. It makes it rare. Think of it like this. You're walking through a forest with others. They need maps, flashlights, GPS. You move differently. You know how to feel the wind. Read the shadows. Hear the shifts in silence. They call you distant. But you're just moving with a different kind of awareness, one they don't yet understand. And that's not your burden. It's your gift. Your emotional style is a filter. It protects you from overexposure. It allows you to choose intentionality over impulse. It helps you build deeper connections, not faster ones. And it gives you space to feel fully, without being consumed. That's maturity. That's evolution. And that's exactly what high-integrity relationships, leadership, and healing require. So what now? Now you stop apologizing. You stop explaining your stillness to people who mistake silence for absence. You stop proving your value through emotional translations that leave you drained. Instead, you begin listening to your emotional compass again. You ask, what does my body know before my mind explains it? What does my calm tell me about what matters? Where is my emotional neutrality trying to guide me? Because you're not behind. You're ahead. You're not broken. You're boundaried. You're not cold. You're clear. And from this moment on, your clarity is not up for debate. It's your direction. It's your alignment. It's your quiet revolution. So here's the invitation. Don't just defend your emotional style. Lead with it. Let it guide your relationships, your boundaries, your self-worth. Let it choose your people, your pace, your peace. And the next time someone says, you're hard to read, smile. And remember, compasses don't need to be loud to be accurate. If you've made it this far, you know now that there was never anything cold about you. What they called distant was depth. What they labeled detached was regulation. And what they misunderstood as silence was the sound of a nervous system that's done performing. You've spent years adapting, shrinking, softening your truth to keep others comfortable. You've tried to explain your calm, translate your pauses, validate your restraint, but not anymore. Because this isn't just emotional awareness, this is a homecoming. To the way your brain works, to the way your nervous system protects you, to the kind of presence that doesn't need performance to be powerful. You've seen now that your emotional style is not a flaw, it's a compass. That the people who misread you are often reading their own discomfort. That stillness, clarity, composure are signs of maturity, not absence. And most of all, that you don't need to become louder to be seen. You just need to be aligned to be heard. So here's what I want you to carry forward. You are not emotionally distant. You are emotionally discerning. You are not hard to read. You are not available for misinterpretation. And the people who get that are the ones who are ready for your kind of depth. So if this message hit something real, don't leave it here. Subscribe, not just to this channel, but to this level of emotional truth. Hit the bell, not for noise, but for reminders that your quiet matters here. And share this with one person who's been called cold, who's never had a name for what they carry. Until now, because they're not broken, they're built for something different. And now, so are you. See you in the next one. But more than that, see yourself more clearly from this one forward.